Hi, I'm Jeff Yarger. I'm a professor of chemistry, biochemistry, and physics.
Hi, I'm Rylee Yarger. I'm a type 1 diabetic and co-founder of diabetics.org with with a 1 instead of an I.
And I'm Jordan. I'm the other co-founder of Diabetics. And yeah, welcome to our show.
So I wanted to make this video to look at, I think of dealing with type 1 diabetes, or really dealing with diabetes in general, type 1 or type 2. You know, there's several things that you deal with every day. Let's start with the most obvious, blood sugar, right? Like glucose, blood sugar, what are carbohydrates, diet, right? All kind of associated. Then what's the side? Why do you need to know that? Because that's going to dictate insulin. And, you know, that's the next part, like how much insulin, what am I bolusing, what am I basaling, or if you're doing shots, what long acting, what short acting. I mean, there's a whole terminologies here. And that's day to day, that's every day of your life. But oftentimes what's used is as far as kind of a long-term progress, like a kind of not an everyday goal, but several times a year, like, are things going well? Am I able to keep my blood sugar levels at a level that people without diabetes, people whose pancreas works properly, whose natural feedback loop for as you eat carbohydrates, as you have sugar in your blood, how it's taken care of by producing insulin, getting it into your cells, et cetera. Is that, working, well? And what has been custom in the medical community now is to use, typically what I would say is, you would probably just say A1C, right?
Yeah.
And what this is glycosylated, or I would say glycosylated hemoglobin. And so hemoglobin is what makes your blood red, and it's what carries oxygen into your cells, et cetera. And it can have sugars attached to it, but it equilibrates over long times. And they give you a value for this that kind of tells you your long-term blood sugar, right? And as we've talked about before, learning stuff, looking at some of the research behind this, I think it's always very interesting that this paper that came out in 2008, and it's in Diabetes Research and Clinical Practice, and I've listed the authors here in the journal. It asks what I would say a very pertinent question. You guys get your A1Cs done every 3 to 4 months, right?
Yeah.
So, and kind of like a lot of other things, you would just know a number. I would say, what's your A1C? And you would just probably give me a number, somewhere between, hopefully down into the 5s and 6s, but typically up near the 9, 10, 11, 12 range, right? I mean, you would just give me a number. And you have a sense for if that number is good or bad. And if it gets too high, it starts getting bad, and the lower it gets, the better, right? And what this letter to the editor was asking is, does the A1C measurement, does it represent a valid index for a tight control of glucose in type 1 diabetics? You're type 1 diabetics. Do you feel like that number has, helped you? Do you feel like it gives you a general sense of your overall health?
In my opinion, I feel like when I get that number, the endocrinologist typically has a few paper sheets printed out from the diagnostics, I would say, but they usually only cover about the last 2 weeks before the appointment or before you get it checked. So I'd say it only really affects that month before, and not typically that 2 to 3 month time span that they give you. So when they say your A1C is we'll just give a really bad number. Don't worry, I don't have this number. But if it's 12 or 13 or something like that, then they're you probably did really bad in the last month, but we're not really sure if you did bad in the past 3 months overall. So I feel it's more of a tight control in just a short time span, and not exactly
really long term.
Yeah, really long term, exactly.
What is the biggest swing you've ever had in A1C levels? How many percentage points up or down have you had between endocrinologist visits? Have you ever had a swing of more than 2 or 3 units?
You were telling me earlier that you had a swing of like 6, I believe.
Well, your normal one is, or a normal one for like you said for like someone without diabetes is 3.
More like 5.
Or 5. Well, let's just say those are dark days. But I've had a A1C of about 14, which is extremely bad, we'll just say. But let's just say I had way too many sugar molecules. I never bolused. I never gave myself insulin. I never tested. And that one probably was a little bit more accurate just because it did cover those 3 months that I was not doing so well. But you can quickly recover from stuff like that if you just keep like a better diet. You make sure you're on top of all your bolusing and all your site changes, just anything like that. But
and so then 3 months later when you went back, you were much lower number?
I was much lower. I was about an 8 or 9, which is a lot better.
And I would say that makes sense. I mean, like, just for people who don't know, I mean, we're in a sense what this is. The first one is standing for the hemoglobin, and it's telling you that, this is kind of showing a very cartoon that glucose, shown in kind of these hexagons, can bind to red blood cells or bind to hemoglobin. More specifically, this is kind of showing a blob structure of what the hemoglobin protein looks like, and the blues are the sugars, and you can see these reds are the heme. It's where the iron heme molecule binds oxygen, and you can see here and here, and you can see there's just kind of randomly around the surface, there's a lot of different places sugar can bind. And this is kind of showing bound sugar and ones that aren't bound, right? And it's that equilibrium that, like you said, it doesn't happen, minute by minute or second by second. It's in the, like you said, weeks to month range. And so it gives you kind of a more long-term, not just what your blood sugar is right now, but what average it's been over we'll say about a month, and that's exactly what this paper showed. And, what I'm showing here on the y-axis is your glucose concentration in milligram per deciliter. Now, you would just know that as your number. In fact, that's what I'd say. So what's your number? I don't even have to say what's your blood glucose number, right? All as a diabetic, I would have to say is, okay, we're going to go eat. What's your number? Or, are you feeling good today? What's your number been? What's your number's been, right? And you would just know that as that, right? And you would know that if you said, something like under 100, somewhere between, we'll call it 70 and 90, you would say, I'm perfect. If you saw something below 70, 60, you would say I'm a little low. Below 40, you'd say I'm really low. I'm not feeling so good, right? Above, say 120, 130, you'd say I'm a little high. Above 200, you'd say I'm kind of high. Above 300, you'd be like, I'm really high. And from that, discussion, you can even tell which one is the diabetic without even reading anything, and which one is the non-diabetic. It's very obvious, right? Like you're a typical diabetic, your blood sugar, just varies a lot more than somebody without blood sugar or without diabetes. They always stay in a very narrow range, no matter if they've just eaten a candy bar or not. Your body can regulate you very, very well. And no matter how good of the technology we have to date, it's just much harder, even with insulin pumps, even with everything, to regulate carbohydrates and intake of sugar nearly as well as they do. But what this study was showing is you can see, for the most part, these are people who, we'll just take this person, for example, they have some, their average is still at the same, the average is still perfect. The mean is 100, mean 100, 100, mean 100, 100, So they almost all have the same mean. In other words, the same average glucose. And hence they have the same A1Cs, 5 across here, 5, 5, 5, 6, right? And what this study basically shows is that, we got to be careful because, as you said, it tells you kind of an average over time so that you don't just have to look at one data point and say, God, I'm a 200, I have really bad blood sugar. It really is just kind of averaging it over a month. But you could have gathered that just from averaging these daily blood sugar numbers. I mean, in a sense, by knowing your average, which you get from CGMs or you get from all your blood pricks, you could almost guess your A1C before you go in to the doctor. They're just verifying that the average is what you would expect from what you can see here over that month. And what this study is saying is that the real big difference can be seen in this plot, right? Which is, it's keeping these very tight tolerances. It's never going much above 100, 120, never going below, 70. And that's just much harder to do as a diabetic. And that's what this study was pointing out is that it's probably time that we really focus on the glycemic control, not just the mean glucose value. Because what they're finding, and they give some evidence of this, is that it's this keeping this very tight control that really has a much bigger effect on your overall health than just what your average is. So I just thought that was interesting because it brings to bear exactly something you care about. You're doing this because really what you're worried about is you want to control your blood sugar so that you have overall, long-term health, right?
I agree. It's just like when you said the question and it had the word tight control specifically, I could already tell you that that's not really what an A1C was per se, because if it's an average, if you're really high and really low and you take an average, it's going to be in the middle.
Right.
But that's not where you were. You were really high and really low, which isn't good because you shouldn't be fluctuating so much. So I'd say if you measured more the fluctuation, that would be a good sign of health if you're fluctuating within a given range.
And that's, I would say, in comments, so your variance or something, how much you vary, over a day, et cetera. And that's something I think that gets hugely overlooked in diabetes. I mean, is there a day that you've not varied at least 100 units?
Probably not.
I think maybe on a good day, you only vary by like 50 maybe. You like go between like maybe 150 and 80. So that's like 50 plus. But I think on a good day, you can sometimes get that. But I do admit, like, you do vary a lot having diabetes because you're just constantly getting affected by different things. If you exercise, all of a sudden, your blood sugar normally drops. You can correct that with insulin, sometimes by lowering your insulin or temp basaling, but still, or when you eat, immediately when you eat, your blood sugar goes up. And it's like, you're supposed to dose 15 minutes before, probably for that reason. I don't know if all of us really do that, though.
Well, it's very hard, right? It's very hard to get those things really precise where it just stays even. Right?
And then you have to know how carbs affect you. Like, if I eat a donut, I'm not dosing for the amount of carbs it says is in a donut because I already know that's going to make me go higher. So I will dose higher for a donut because I know those carbs seem to just affect me faster.
And I think that gets just to the general thing of, it's always, they try to give it to you in simple, digestible terms, but these things always end up being more complicated. How sugars absorb because of the other components in the food, how much fat is in the food, how much, varies a lot, how much fiber, and carbohydrates themselves. I mean, the word stems from hydrated forms of carbon, but, and you start with the one you're most familiar with, which is sugar, which is typically just a mono or a disaccharide, meaning one sugar unit, or di meaning two. But really all carbohydrates are any length of that chain. And the longer they get, they move from simple sugars to complex sugars to starches to eventually to insoluble fibers that never get absorbed. Well, that's a whole continuous range in a sense. And it's really hard to come to grips with. In other words, it's really complicated to actually get all those things right and how they're going to break down in your body and get eventually turned into sugars, which ones aren't, how they're going to come out based on the other food that's in there, et cetera. And that's what makes this a very difficult one to really keep, perfect, right? And so, what this paper I think is just trying to point out is that a lot of emphasis is being put on just kind of that single number, because we all like that. We just like that, oh, our single, we've been pretty good. And what it's saying though is that actually you could be very bad. You could have a really good A1C number, but really you fluctuated from very lows to very highs, and that is much more dangerous to your health than, than just keeping, a very tight control on that. And that not just diabetics, but people working on the technology, we need to, work on that as well. Like you have ones that have feedback loops, like, how much better can we control those, ranges? So thank you for the discussion today.
Thank you for joining us today.